she handed me her coat that night, saying, "Take this to the cleaner, will you?" I didn't think much of it until the shop owner pulled out an envelope from the pocket and looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. Inside were papers with my name forged, my house signed away. I drove home in silence, my chest heavy, my hands shaking. How could my own blood plan to erase me from my home? But what they didn't know was that I had been keeping something safe, something that could turn all of this against them. And when the time comes, they'll realize the old man they thought was weak had been preparing all along. Follow my story until the end. Subscribe to the channel, and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far my story travels. The house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary, a scent that should have felt warm and welcoming. Yet, sitting at the far end of my daughter's dining table, the laughter and chatter around me felt distant, as though I were a guest in a place I once called home. Forks clinked against plates, and the younger ones spoke over each other about promotions, new cars, and vacation plans. Alethea, my daughter-in-law, poured herself another glass of wine, her eyes sweeping across me before landing on her husband. "My son," with a smirk, she said, "some folks never change, still clinging to those old-fashioned habits. Imagine living without online banking in this day and age." The table chuckled softly. "Everyone except me." I lowered my gaze, hiding the sting that settled deep inside. Words wanted to rise, to defend myself. But years of swallowing such remarks had trained me to stay silent. I cut another bite of chicken instead, the meat dry in my mouth. The conversation rolled on without me, as it always did. It was easier for them when I was invisible. I remembered when my opinion carried weight, when my hands built the very foundation they all now stood on. But those days had slipped away, leaving me as little more than an afterthought. Later, coats were gathered, chairs scraped against hardwood, and the evening wound down. My daughter handed me Alethea's navy coat with a polite but detached smile. "Dad, could you drop this at the dry cleaner tomorrow? She needs it pressed before Friday." Her tone carried no malice, but it was matter of fact, like I had no life of my own, like my existence was only useful when filling in their errands. I stepped out into the December air, the cold biting at my cheeks, the coat folded neatly over my arm. My breath puffed in clouds before me as I made my way toward my car. It wasn't the first time they'd asked me for small favors, but tonight, something in Alethea's hurried voice struck me as odd. She'd insisted the coat needed attention right away, as if it carried more weight than mere fabric. The next afternoon, I pushed open the door to Klein's dry cleaning, a little shop I'd known for decades. "Mr." Klein greeted me with the same tired smile he'd offered for years, his spectacles sliding down his nose as he scribbled on a ticket pad. The familiar scent of pressed linen and detergent hung in the air. "Evening," I said, laying the coat on the counter. "Evening." "Harold," he replied, lifting the coat with careful hands. As he checked the pockets, a routine he never skipped, his fingers froze. Slowly, he drew out a sealed envelope, cream-colored and thick, the flap tightly pressed. His eyes flicked up to mine, something uncertain lingering there. He placed the envelope gently on the counter, sliding it toward me. "You should keep this," he murmured, lowering his voice. "Doesn't look like it belongs in here." The room seemed to shrink around me. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the envelope. It had no markings, no address, no hint of its contents. My heart thudded in my chest. Why would Alethea tuck something away so carefully, hidden from even her own husband, Mr.? Klein hesitated, his lips parting as though to say more, but then he pressed them shut. He scribbled the claim ticket, handed it over, and gave a small nod. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket, its weight heavier than it had any right to be. The wind howled as I stepped back outside, snowflakes swirling beneath the street lamps. My boots crunched against the icy pavement while thoughts tangled in my mind. The envelope burned against my chest, daring me to tear it open right there on the sidewalk. Yet fear raw, unfamiliar fear clawed at me. What secret could possibly warrant such secrecy? What truth had I unknowingly carried home with me tonight? I stood under the falling snow, clutching the envelope, unable to breathe easily. My instincts screamed that opening it would change everything I thought I knew about my family. My fingers tightened around it, and the world seemed to hush, leaving only the sound of my own heartbeat. The envelope sat on my kitchen table like a shadow I couldn't shake off. The house was silent except for the old clock on the wall, its ticking almost mocking my hesitation. I circled the table more than once, rubbing the back of my neck, staring at that slim rectangle of paper as though it could bite me. Part of me wanted to toss it in the drawer and forget I had ever seen it. Another part colder. Sharper knew that whatever was hidden inside had the power to change everything I thought I knew about my family. Hands trembling. I finally slid a finger under the seal. The tear sounded louder than it should have in the stillness of the night. A few sheets of paper slipped out, and I unfolded them slowly. At first, the legal language didn't register. Then the words hit me like ice water: property transfer agreement. My name, my address, my house, but the signature at the bottom wasn't mine. I dropped into the chair, gripping the edges of the papers until my knuckles turned white. Whoever had signed this had done a near-perfect job of forging my hand. A wave of disbelief washed over me, followed by nausea so strong I thought I might be sick right there. I set the papers down, blinked hard, and picked them up again, hoping they would say something different the second time. They didn't. My wife's voice came back to me in that moment, from years ago, as clear as if she were standing by my side. She had always said the house was more than bricks and wood. It was the last thread holding our family together. No matter what happens, she told me, don't let this home leave our bloodline. And now here I was, staring at proof that someone had tried to rip it right from under me. The warmth of that memory clashed cruelly with the cold weight of betrayal in my hands. There was no doubt left in my mind this wasn't a mistake. Someone close to me wanted me erased, shoved aside like an old coat in the closet. My chest burned with anger, then chilled with fear. Who would dare? Who could benefit? My daughter? No. My son-in-law, every instinct screamed yes. And my daughter-in-law, she was the one who had pressed me about that coat. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat with those papers, reading the forged signature over and over again until my eyes blurred. By dawn, my course was set. I couldn't let this fester in silence. The following day, I found myself pushing open the door to the dry cleaners again. The bell above jingled, and Mr. Thompson, the owner, looked up with a start. He greeted me politely enough, but his eyes darted away, as though he had something on his mind he didn't dare say. Back so soon, he asked, wiping his hands nervously on a rag. I laid the papers on the counter without explanation. He glanced down, then back up at me, his face tightening. For a long moment, he said nothing. I pressed, my voice hoarse. You found the envelope. Did you know what was inside? His hesitation was a confession in itself. Finally, he leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but when your daughter-in-law dropped off the coat, she wasn't alone. There was a man with her. I overheard them whispering. The air in the shop seemed to thin. Whispering what I asked. His eyes shifted toward the door, as if afraid someone might walk in. Then he sighed. I remember her saying, "The papers are ready. He won't know until it's too late." The words slammed into me harder than the forged signature. There it was, confirmation. This wasn't paranoia or a mistake. This was deliberate, calculated, planned. I left the shop in a daze, snow crunching under my boots, the wind cutting through my coat but barely felt against the fire in my chest. My thoughts spiraled. How could my own bloodline betray me like this? Why strip me of the only place left that still felt like mine? The home where I had laughed, fought, and grown old with the woman I loved. The papers trembled in my hands, though not from the cold. For the first time in years, a dangerous clarity settled over me. They thought they could erase me quietly, but they had underestimated the strength of an old man with nothing left to lose. The pages shook in my hands, not from the cold, but from the truth I could no longer ignore. The night after uncovering those forged papers dragged on endlessly. The lamp above the kitchen table buzzed softly while the envelope lay open, its contents spread out like a wound I couldn't close. Sleep refused to come. Each tick of the wall clock seemed to push me further into a fog of doubt. When the phone rang the next morning, it was my daughter inviting me to Sunday dinner. I hesitated, nearly declining, but something inside urged me to go. If there were answers, I'd find them at that table. The air carried the sharp bite of late winter as I walked up her steps. I noticed right away how different the greeting felt. Smiles thinner, hugs looser. My daughter's husband gave me a quick nod, but no warmth. Even the grandchildren, usually bounding toward me, seemed quieter, as if someone had whispered instructions before I arrived. The atmosphere clung to me like damp clothes. Inside, the dining table stretched long and polished, covered with dishes that smelled of rosemary and butter. Yet as I reached for my usual chair, I froze. It wasn't there. Instead, the space where I always sat had been filled with an extra serving tray. My daughter laughed lightly, brushing it off as a miscount. My son-in-law echoed her, saying, "We're just tight on space tonight." Their words tried to soften the blow, but the meaning struck like a hammer. I was no longer part of the arrangement. I sat at the corner, wedged awkwardly between a sideboard and a chair leg. From that angle, the laughter of my family felt distant, as if I were an observer instead of one of them. A polite smile stayed fixed on my face, but underneath it burned humiliation. Every bite of food turned to ash. After dinner, while others carried dishes away, my eyes caught the framed family calendar hanging in the hallway. It was something my daughter kept: updated birthdays, photos, little notes scribbled for events. This time, my breath caught in my chest. My picture was gone. My name, erased from the list of birthdays and anniversaries. The frame gleamed under the light, mocking me with its polished neatness. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate. I lingered there, my reflection mingling with the missing space. A wave of grief surged first, then anger. All the sacrifices I had made working overtime when I should have been home, keeping the house intact after my wife passed, paying for college tuition, even the mortgage they now wanted to erase me like chalk on a board. A small hand tugged my sleeve. My grandson looked up at me with wide eyes. "Grandpa, why isn't your picture there?" His innocent voice carried more weight than any insult. I swallowed hard, unable to answer. My daughter's voice called him back before I could muster a response, and he ran off, leaving me standing in the hollow silence of the hallway. I excused myself early, mumbling something about being tired. On the porch, the cold night air struck sharp against my face, but it wasn't the chill that made me shiver. It was the knowledge that my own family wanted me gone, not just from the house, not just from their lives, but even from their memory. As I walked away, my mind clung to the image of that calendar, of the missing chair, of the grandson's question. Determination began to take shape where sorrow had been. They might want to erase me, but I would uncover just how far this betrayal reached. When even your own blood pretends you don't exist, the pain cuts deeper than any knife. The night after leaving their dinner early, I told myself I wouldn't set foot back in that house. Yet by morning, my phone rang with a familiar pressure in my daughter's voice. She said the whole family would be gathering again on Sunday. Cousins, uncles, and aunts, people I hadn't seen in months. If I didn't come, she said, it would look awkward. That word carried the same sting as always, a polite cover for shame, against my better judgment. I agreed. When I walked through their front door, the air felt heavy. Even though everyone smiled, my daughter clung to her husband's side, barely glancing in my direction. Conversations swirled around me, but none pulled me in. It was as if I had become furniture in the room, present but unacknowledged. It happened midway through the meal, when the clinking of forks and glasses filled the silence. My daughter-in-law's voice cut across the table, loud enough to carry over the laughter. Maybe we shouldn't let Dad handle things on his own anymore, she said. Her fork paused mid-air. He can barely manage his checkbook. The words landed like a slap. A few cousins chuckled nervously. One of my nephews smirked, hiding it behind his napkin. Others avoided my eyes, busying themselves with plates they had already cleaned. Heat rose in my face, but I forced my lips into what must have looked like a smile. My dignity hung by a thread. The walls closed in with every second of silence, and yet I said nothing. Years of swallowing insults had trained me too well. I slipped out to the porch, needing the cold air more than the food inside. My heart thudded, the ache heavier than any winter chill, as I leaned against the railing, staring at the bare trees. A young cousin approached me, his phone in his hand. "Uncle," he said hesitantly, "I think I got something by mistake." He showed me the screen, an email chain, my name, my address, the subject line house listing draft. The words blurred, but one line stabbed clear through, "Let's push the sale before he notices. He won't fight it." It was signed by my daughter-in-law. My own son's reply sat beneath it, agreed. The sooner the better. The cold air burned my lungs. Betrayal wasn't a whisper anymore. It was typed, signed, and sent. I returned inside, every eye turning briefly before sliding away. They still laughed, still clinked glasses, still acted as though the world was in order. I sat back down, keeping my face calm, though every nerve in me screamed. They thought they had won. They thought age had dulled me, that humiliation would silence me. But their words, their schemes, had only fed the fire. Inside, I made a vow. This would not be the last laugh they had at my expense. It would be the first step toward their reckoning. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity, but they had only lit the fire I needed to fight back. The house was quiet when I returned that night, the kind of silence that felt heavier than noise. My coat slid off onto the chair, but I didn't bother to hang it. The sting of what had happened lingered, every word replaying in my mind, every smirk etched into memory. Sitting at the kitchen table, the same one my wife used to polish until it shone, I felt the walls closing in. I reached for the one place that had always given me solace, her old recipe box. It sat in the cupboard, tucked behind stacks of dishes nobody touched anymore. My hands trembled when I pulled it out, the lid squeaking like a whisper from the past. Inside were cards stained with flour, dotted with grease marks, her handwriting looping with grace I could never match. The apple pie recipe lay on top, as if waiting for me. My wife had baked it every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every time one of us needed comfort. Reading her words, "Don't skimp on the cinnamon. It keeps the heart warm," was like hearing her voice again. For a moment, warmth pushed away the humiliation of that weekend. I leaned back, eyes closed, letting the memory of her laughter fill the room. She always said that as long as we sat down together over a meal, no one could tear this family apart. Yet here I was, alone, while the others plotted to erase me. Her recipe wasn't just about pie. It was about survival, about fighting to stay present even when others tried to push you out. Her words came back to me. Never let anyone erase you from your own home. They rang louder now, a challenge I needed to accept. My heart steadied. If they thought I would simply fade away, they had forgotten who I was before grief had quieted me. The next morning, I walked into the local bank. The warmth of the pie memory still lingered in my chest, but reality was waiting. The teller smiled politely, then handed me over to a manager, a young man in a neat suit with nervous eyes. He closed his office door behind us, lowered his voice, and told me something that made the blood rush from my face. There had been an attempted transfer from my savings account, a large one, enough to rattle the safety I had worked my whole life to build. The bank's system had flagged it as suspicious, but the request had all the right information, my details, my signature, even the answers to security questions. "Mr. Bellamy," he said carefully, "whoever tried to move this money had access to things they shouldn't have." The pie recipe had been a whisper of hope, but this was a punch of dread. My mind spun. How had they gotten that information? Who else but family could know those things? I thought about the forged papers in the envelope, the whispered conversations at the dry cleaner, the humiliations at dinner. The puzzle was no longer scattered. It was forming a picture. Walking out of the bank, the cold air bit harder than usual. Snowflakes clung to my coat, but I barely noticed. The recipe card was still at home, waiting in its box, proof that I wasn't alone. Not really, but the bank statement in my pocket reminded me I was under siege. They weren't just after dignity, they wanted everything. Standing at the corner, I made a vow. I would not let them win. They could laugh at me, erase my name, even strip me of place at the table. But my wife's words and the strength of all we built together still lived in me. That they could never take. The pie recipe gave me strength, but the bank papers reminded me that my war had only just begun. That evening, the house felt smaller than ever. The air was heavy, pressing down on me as if even the walls had learned my family's intentions and now conspired to suffocate me. I tried to keep busy washing dishes that didn't need washing, adjusting the thermostat though it was already set, but the silence wouldn't let me escape. From the living room, I caught the faint glow of a phone screen. My son's voice floated through the air, sharp and careless. He had left the speaker on without realizing. "Make sure Dad won't be able to stop the house transfer," he said. My knees buckled. The words slammed into me like a physical blow. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, that the ringing in my ears had twisted his words. But then her voice joined his, the calm, clipped tone of my daughter-in-law. "It's all in motion. He's old. He doesn't need that place anymore. Once the papers are finalized, there's nothing he can do." The room spun. My hands shook against the edge of the table, pressing down so hard I thought the wood might crack. Every ounce of doubt, every shred of hope that maybe I was mistaken, dissolved in that instant. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My own flesh and blood, planning my erasure as casually as one might discuss grocery shopping. I wanted to burst into the room, to shout, to demand why. Instead, I stood frozen, heart hammering in my chest, terrified that my voice would break into a sob rather than a shout. The phone call ended, but its echo stayed lodged inside me. Betrayal is louder than any voice. It reverberates long after the words are gone. Later that afternoon, still shaken, I stepped outside just to breathe. The cold Cleveland air cut into my skin, but it steadied me. That's when Mrs. Keller, my neighbor of 20 years, waved from her porch. She was carrying a basket of laundry, her scarf flapping in the wind. "Rough day?" she asked, a little too knowingly. I forced a half smile. "Something like that." She hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but I overheard your daughter-in-law talking in the driveway yesterday. She was bragging to some man about big changes once the old man is out of the way." the words sliced deeper than the wind ever could. My throat tightened. Even the neighbors knew of my downfall before I did. Walking back inside, my heart burned not just with hurt, but with humiliation. My family's betrayal wasn't private anymore. It had become gossip, a story for others to whisper about over fences and in grocery aisles. I sat down at the table, pulling out the forged documents again. My fingers gripped the edges until they crumpled, the paper trembling with the same fury that ran through my blood. This was no longer about property, or even dignity. It was about survival. If I stayed silent, they would erase me completely. The time for swallowing insults had passed. When your own neighbors know of your erasure before you do, silence is no longer an option. The house was too quiet that night. After everything I had endured, the humiliation at the dinner table, the whispered betrayal I overheard through the phone, and even Mrs. Keller's casual remark that confirmed it was no longer just my private burden, the silence felt unbearable. The clock ticked steadily in the kitchen, each sound a reminder of how long the night stretched ahead of me. I stepped outside to clear my head. The air in Cleveland was sharp with the bite of early winter, and for a moment I thought about turning right back around and going inside. That's when I noticed the corner of white sticking out from the rusted flap of my old green mailbox. Mail. Sure, but not like this. A simple envelope, yellowed slightly as though it had been waiting. My name was scrawled across the front, in a handwriting I recognized instantly. My chest tightened. Gregory. Gregory had been gone for weeks now, laid to rest in that small cemetery by the river. Yet here was his handwriting firm, familiar, almost alive. My fingers trembled as I pulled it free, the cold suddenly forgotten. No one sent letters anymore. Not really. And Gregory had no reason to write me unless he knew something. I carried it inside, sat at the table where the weight of another envelope, the one from the coat, still haunted me. For long minutes I only stared at it, afraid of what it might hold. Then, with a shaky breath, I tore it open. The letter began simply, "My friend. If you're reading this, then something in my bones was right all along." Gregory's words spilled across the page in that careful script of his. He spoke of conversations he'd overheard, concerns he'd had about my daughter-in-law's eagerness to get close to the family's legal affairs. He wrote plainly, "Do not trust them with the deeds. Guard your house. Guard your savings. I fear they see you not as a man, but as an obstacle." I froze. He had known. He had seen what I couldn't, or what I refused to admit. The paper trembled between my hands. My mind raced back to that last time we'd met, when he had looked at me with something like pity, telling me to keep my affairs in order. I had brushed him off then, convinced he was being overly cautious, maybe even a little paranoid. Now it felt like a warning from beyond the grave. I pushed the letter aside and buried my face in my hands. Memories of Gregory crowded in, the way he'd stayed by me after my wife died, how he'd fixed the old railing on my porch without ever asking for thanks, how he'd always said a man's dignity was his last line of defense. Reading his words was like hearing his voice in the room. My throat burned, my eyes stung, but alongside the grief came something else: strength. Anger. Yes, but also resolve. Gregory had believed this betrayal was coming. He had seen it clearer than I had. "Gregory," I whispered into the empty room, "you tried to warn me, and now, even gone, you're still fighting for me." The letter wasn't just a comfort. It was a weapon. At the bottom of the envelope, tucked carefully behind the folded pages, I found more. Photocopies of documents, rough but clear enough to understand. Bank records, land deeds, and a note in Gregory's handwriting. "He approached me about buying part of your property, said you wouldn't stand in the way." I didn't trust him. My heart nearly stopped. I knew who Gregory meant, my son-in-law. The pieces fell together too neatly, the forged documents, the erased name, the whispered conversations. This wasn't just idle talk or careless disrespect. It was a conspiracy, premeditated, coordinated, a plan to erase me and take what was mine before I was even gone. I pressed the papers flat against the table, staring at the proof. The anger burned hot, but beneath it all, an odd calm settled in. Gregory had handed me the truth. Even from beyond his grave, he had given me the one thing my family thought I didn't have any more leverage. I gripped the letter tight, the pages crinkling in my hand. "Gregory," I said softly, voice thick with emotion. "You may be gone, but you've armed me for the fight." Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the quiet street in pale light. But inside, my war had just found a new weapon. The morning light barely crept through the curtains when the knock came. It wasn't forceful, but steady 3 raps that broke through the stillness of dawn. My heart skipped a beat. After everything I had uncovered, the forged papers, the whispers, Gregory's letter, early visitors felt less like neighbors and more like threats. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The cold air seeping in through the cracks smelled of snow and damp wood. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but curiosity, sharpened by fear, won out. When I opened the door, a man stood there with tired eyes and a leather satchel pressed against his chest. His voice was low, respectful, but carried a weight that made me uneasy. "Mr. Bellamy. I was a friend of Gregory's. He asked me to come if anything ever happened to him." The mention of Gregory's name jolted me. My late friend had been gone for months, yet somehow he was still reaching out, still guarding me even from the grave. I stepped aside, motioning him in, though suspicion lingered in my gut. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where the envelope first appeared nights ago. He opened his satchel and carefully pulled out a sealed envelope, the words "For your eyes only" written in Gregory's bold hand. My chest tightened. The man explained. "Gregory told me there were things you might need to see, things he didn't trust leaving in anyone else's care. He suspected someone close to you would try to take advantage. He wanted you to be ready." My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. Inside were documents thicker than the first batch, pages of deeds and contracts. My eyes darted across signatures, my daughter Ellen's handwriting. She had signed off on property transfers without ever speaking to me. It wasn't just Victor, her husband, pulling the strings. Ellen was part of it too. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. The betrayal that had begun with whispers was now inked in black and white. My own daughter had helped erase me from the home I had built with her mother. The man's voice cut through my silence. "Gregory told me you might not believe it unless you saw it yourself. He worried about how much you trusted your family. He said, blood can cut deeper than a stranger's knife." I wanted to scream, to slam the papers on the table, to march over to Ellen's house and demand answers. But all I could do was sit there, the weight of the papers crushing me. My wife's face came to mind, her voice reminding me not to let anyone erase me. The recipe box upstairs suddenly felt like a relic of a life I no longer recognized. The visitor leaned closer, his tone urgent. "Mr. Bellamy, Gregory warned me this would come. And now that you've seen these papers, they'll know you have them. You must be careful." I walked him to the door, my thoughts racing faster than my feet. Betrayal had turned from a suspicion into a storm, swallowing my trust whole. As the man left, his last words lingered. "They'll come for you next, not just the house." I stood frozen in the doorway, the envelope still clutched tight. The morning sun had risen higher, but it brought no warmth. The knock at dawn hadn't just brought a man. It had brought undeniable proof that my own blood had turned against me. The papers in my pocket felt heavier than stones as I walked up to Ellen's porch. It was a house I had helped her buy once, years ago, when she and Victor were just starting out. I remembered signing papers, writing checks, even rolling up my sleeves to paint her kitchen cabinets. Now, standing in front of that same door, it felt like I was stepping onto foreign soil. Ellen opened the door before I could knock twice. Her arms were folded, her shoulders squared, and there was no warmth in her eyes. For a second, I hoped she might soften. Maybe ask me why I came. Maybe even offer coffee like she used to. But her lips tightened instead, and her voice was sharp as she said, "So, you came to make things harder." Inside, the living room looked just the same, the beige couch, the family photos on the wall, the soft rug my late wife once admired. Yet it all felt staged, like a set where I no longer belonged. Her words came at me like stones. "You're greedy, Dad. You've had your life, your time. Why can't you just let us take care of things now? Why hold on to a house you can't manage?" I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Greedy. After all the years I broke my back to make sure she never went without. She leaned against the arm of the couch, her tone dripping with disdain. "You keep clinging to the past, but none of that matters anymore. You think sacrifices you made decades ago still give you the right to dictate our future." I wanted to speak, to defend the countless nights I worked double shifts, the mornings I skipped meals so she and her brother could eat. But the words stuck in my throat. My own daughter, my Ellen, was looking at me as though I was a burden, a thief in her story. The blow deepened when she said it plainly, "Yes, I signed the papers. I signed because Victor was right. This house, this property, it should secure our future, not keep rotting under you. You'd only waste it." For a moment the room tilted. She wasn't tricked. She wasn't pressured into something she didn't understand. She had chosen this, chosen Victor's plan, chosen to erase me willingly. I whispered, "You mean you knew all along?" She didn't blink. "Of course." I agreed. "It's what's best for us." That word "us" cut deeper than any accusation. There was no us that included me anymore. It was her and Victor, standing shoulder to shoulder against the man who raised her. The grief inside me shifted, hardened, turned cold. I felt something snap into place. There would be no more begging for recognition, no more waiting for scraps of respect. I straightened my back, the way I used to when walking onto the factory floor. My voice came out calm, steadier than I expected. "If that's how you see it, Ellen, then I've heard enough." I turned toward the door. My steps were slow, deliberate. But just as I reached the threshold, Victor appeared, leaning against the frame with that smug grin of his. He looked me up and down and said, almost lazily, "So, you finally know." The smirk twisted in my gut like a knife, deeper than Ellen's words. I walked past him, silent. But in my chest, the fire was no longer shame. It was resolve. The invitation came from Victor himself. His voice on the phone had carried a strange civility, almost like a performance for an audience I couldn't see, against my better judgment. I went. Something in me still hoped for a thread of clarity, maybe even an explanation. But the moment I walked through their front door, I realized this wasn't an invitation to talk. It was a stage he had set for me to watch him gloat. Victor greeted me with that polished smile he wore so well in public, the one that made people think he was respectable. Ellen stood a few feet behind him, her arms crossed, her gaze glued to the floor. She wouldn't even look at me. It was as though she'd already chosen her side, and Victor was making sure I saw it. We sat in their living room, the air too warm, too heavy. Victor poured me a glass of water, then leaned back like a king addressing a subject. His words came slowly, deliberately, like each one was a knife he wanted me to feel. You know, Dad, he said, smoothing his tie. It's not safe for someone your age to be juggling finances. Ellen and I have taken steps to make sure things are managed properly. For the family's sake. He laid it out as if it were common sense, not treachery. He admitted to redirecting accounts, manipulating property records, convincing Ellen that it was all for security. The casual way he spoke like I was an old fool who should be grateful hit me harder than any accusation. I listened. I let him have his performance. Though my insides burned, he thought silence meant submission, but silence was how I survived wars he couldn't imagine. When I asked why I hadn't been consulted, he smirked. Because sometimes, the family needs protection, even from itself. His tone dripped with arrogance. He was painting me as reckless, incapable, a liability. And then came the twist of the knife. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if savoring the moment. People already know. Dad, the neighbors, folks at church. They see it. They know you can't handle things anymore. I thought back to the cold stares, the half smiles that had stopped reaching eyes, the sudden distance of people I'd known for decades. It wasn't my imagination. Victor had poisoned the well. He'd spun his lies until the community believed them. The humiliation wasn't just private, now it was public. My name, my reputation. Everything I had built was being dismantled in whispers I never even heard. That truth stung deeper than the forged papers. I stood, slow but steady, my heart pounding behind my ribs. Ellen finally lifted her eyes to me, but there was no plea there, no regret, only resignation. She was already lost in his grip. I left without another word. The cold air outside steadied me, sharper than any reply I could have given in their suffocating living room. Victor thought he had bound me in chains of lies and signatures, but chains can break. As I walked home, my steps heavy on the cracked sidewalk, I felt a hand brush mine, an old friend from church, someone I hadn't seen in weeks, slipped an envelope into my palm. His whisper barely carried in the wind. "You need to see this," he said. "It changes everything." The weight of that envelope felt heavier than Victor's entire scheme. It felt like a key pressed into my hand at the exact moment I needed it. The envelope lay on my kitchen table for hours before I finally summoned the courage to open it. My fingers shook as I tore the seal, half afraid of what waited inside, half desperate to know. Bank statements spilled across the wood grain, followed by property transfer slips, each one carrying a signature that looked like mine but wasn't. The curves of the letters, the tilt of the pen, it was close. But I knew my own hand. Someone had forged my name. A weight sank into my chest as I turned page after page. Each document was like a nail hammered into the coffin of my trust. It wasn't just Victor's doing. Ellen's name appeared, too. Her consent scribbled cleanly at the bottom of forms that stripped me of what was mine. The betrayal from a son-in-law I could almost bear, but from my daughter, that wound cut far deeper. I thought back to an old conversation with my lawyer friend Gregory, years before he passed. He'd told me, in that quiet, careful way of his, to always keep my eye on the paperwork. At the time, I'd laughed it off, teasing him for being paranoid. Now his words echoed in my ears, louder than the ticking clock in the kitchen. He had seen something in Victor's ambition that I'd been too blind or too trusting to notice. As the truth settled, so did a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. My grief was still raw, my anger hot. But for the first time, I had something tangible, proof. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the betrayal. They had set their trap. But Gregory's foresight had left me the key to unlock it. 2 days later, I called a few relatives over. Not the whole family, just the ones who still looked me in the eye at gatherings. The ones I thought might listen. They arrived with polite smiles, but I could see doubt clouding their faces. Victor's poison had seeped far. He'd spun his stories well. I laid the papers down on the table one by one. Bank statements, property slips, forged signatures. I didn't speak at first. I just let the silence weigh heavy as they read. Gasps broke the quiet, followed by nervous shifting in chairs. "Is this real?" one of them whispered. I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "It's real. Every line, every signature, and not one of them done with my hand." The room shifted then, the certainty that Victor had enjoyed starting to crack. The silence was uneasy, but I could feel it tilting. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one on trial. He was. Arguments broke out across the table. A cousin who had always defended Victor stammered, trying to make excuses, but the weight of the papers was heavier than his words. Another relative, eyes wide with disbelief, whispered, "I can't believe Ellen would agree to this." I sat back in my chair, exhaustion gnawing at me, but I kept my dignity. My voice didn't rise. My hands didn't shake as I folded the last sheet and slid it back into the envelope. And then the door creaked open. Ellen stood there, her face pale, her knuckles white around the phone in her hand. She looked smaller than I remembered, though maybe it was the guilt weighing her down. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You shouldn't have done this, Dad. Now he'll destroy us all." The room fell silent. Every relative turned to look at her, but her eyes locked only on mine. Her words weren't a warning for herself. They were a threat meant for me. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and paper, the kind of place where history lingered in every corner. Sitting there, my hands folded neatly on my lap, I felt both smaller than I had ever been and stronger than I'd thought possible. Weeks of betrayal, humiliation, and sleepless nights had led to this single moment. I wasn't here to beg for pity. I was here to reclaim what was mine. Victor sat across the aisle, shoulders back, confidence painted on his face like armor. Ellen was beside him, pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, I almost hoped she would look up and see me, see her father not an obstacle, not a burden, but the man who raised her. She never lifted her head. The lawyers began, voices sharp, echoing across the chamber. Each forged signature, every fraudulent transfer was laid out like a surgeon's knife cutting into Victor's schemes. Papers I once feared to touch now stood as my shield. The judge listened intently, face unmoved, while Victor shifted uncomfortably. His smirk faltered for the first time. When Ellen was called, the silence was suffocating. She walked to the witness stand like a woman carrying stones in her chest. Her voice was small, trembling at first, then steadier when the questions pressed harder. She admitted to signing, admitted to knowing. Every word felt like another stone falling between us. I wanted to reach out, to ask her why, but this was not the place for a father's plea. This was a battlefield, and her testimony was a weapon, even if it cut us both. The ruling came swift, almost merciful in its clarity. The judge's voice was firm, the properties and funds were to be restored. The fraud was undeniable. Victor's jaw tightened, his knuckles white against the table. When the gavel struck, it felt like the sound of chains breaking. The weight I had carried lifted by law and truth. Victor erupted, shouting that I had betrayed him, that I was too old to know what I wanted. His words spilled like poison, but no one listened. The bailiffs moved in quickly, holding him back as his voice grew hoarse with rage. I stayed seated, quiet, not because I lacked strength, but because I no longer needed to shout. Dignity didn't need volume. Ellen slipped out quietly, her steps hurried, her shoulders bent low. She couldn't meet my eyes, not even once. There was no satisfaction in watching her leave like that, only sorrow. I had won back my home, my name, my dignity, but in the process, I had lost a daughter to choices she made herself. That night, back in my modest kitchen, I placed the court papers on the table, beside my wife's old recipe box. Her portrait watched over me from the wall. The same calm smile she carried through every storm. I whispered to her picture, telling her that I had done it, I had protected what we built, kept our legacy from being stolen. The truth settled in quietly. Money can be lost and won again. Houses can be sold and reclaimed. But dignity once surrendered is gone forever. That I had refused to give up. Looking at my wife's face in the photo frame, I realized something greater. The inheritance I leave behind isn't just land, deeds, or savings. It's the lesson that no one, no matter how close by blood, has the right to take away a person's worth. I may have lost Ellen, but I kept my soul intact. And that, I understood now, was the only wealth that could never be stolen.